Hello, I'm Ivan Blumenthal. I'm a retired pediatrician. The talk I'm about to give is entitled Child Protection: A History. It has been prepared for a general audience. The early history can be divided into the period before and after 1889. Before 1889, it was not the role of society to interfere within families. Children lived in appalling conditions with much illness and a high childhood mortality. There was little education, and children worked in mines, factories, and chimneys. The poor conditions of children are well illustrated in the writings of Charles Dickens, Victor Hugo, and the Brothers Grimm. After 1889, it was decreed by Parliament that the state would protect children. This is a copy of the 1889 Act. You will see that under Section 1 there would be punishment for ill treatment and neglect of children. Philanthropists had long campaigned for better working conditions for children. This was addressed in Section 3, where there were restrictions on employment of children. It became illegal to employ a boy under 14 and a girl under 16. As part of this act, child beggars became illegal. This is a picture of Etta Wheeler. The journey to modern-day child protection begins with this lady. In the second half of the 19th century, almost half of New York was foreign-born. There had been waves of immigration from Ireland and Eastern Europe. As a consequence of the mass immigration, poverty was found everywhere. Mrs. Wheeler was a Methodist missionary for the poor. She worked at the St. Luke's Mission in New York and was married to a newspaper reporter, Charles Wheeler. Mrs. Wheeler covered a very poor neighborhood known as Hell's Kitchen. It was reported to Mrs. Wheeler that a family with a young child had just moved to a new address. The owner and residents in the vicinity of the previous property had been very concerned about the child. On hearing about the child, Mrs. Wheeler then proceeded to the new address to make inquiries. On arriving near the new address, she asked for directions. She was told that as a stranger, she would not be given access to the property in question. Mrs. Wheeler then decided to knock on the door of the neighbor. She was invited in and found a very sick 45-year-old German lady, Mrs. Schmidt. Mrs. Schmidt told Mrs. Wheeler that the child was beaten frequently and she regularly heard the child crying. Under the pretext of helping a sick neighbor, Mrs. Wheeler did get access to the family with the young child. When Etta Wheeler entered the premises, she immediately noticed a child in the back of the room washing dishes. She subsequently wrote,
"I saw a pale, thin child, barefoot in a thin, scanty dress, so tattered that I could see she wore one garment besides. It was December, and the weather bitterly cold. Across the table lay a brutal whip of twisted leather strands, and the child's meagre arms and legs bore many marks of its use."
Over the next 3 months, the plight of this child greatly concerned Mrs. Wheeler. She did not know who to turn to. She tried the church and tried charities, but was told on each occasion that nothing could be done. She considered visiting Mr. Henry Bergh of the Animal Protection Society, but thought the idea was preposterous. It was only after her niece suggested that she arrange to see Mr. Bergh that she changed her mind and decided to make arrangements to see him. Mr. Bergh said that he would assist her on grounds of humanity, but not on behalf of the society. He asked her to get witness statements and said he would make his own inquiries. Mr. Bergh then wrote to the society lawyer, Mr. Gerry, seeking his advice, As a consequence, the little girl was removed from her home and she would never return. Before I talk about this little girl, I want to show you the letter that Henry Bergh wrote. It is dated April the 8th, 1874, and it's written on the society letterhead. Bergh wrote, "Dear Mr. Gerry, the enclosed letter from the lady to whom I attended this morning speaks for itself. No time is to be lost. Instruct me how to proceed." This little girl is Mary Ellen Wilson. This photograph was taken at the time of her removal from the family. It should be noted that next to her feet there's a pair of scissors. This is a close-up view of Mary Ellen's face. You will notice that the wound on the left side narrowly missed her left eye. Mary Ellen said that she had been attacked with a pair of scissors. This photograph was taken a year later, and I've included it to show you the contrast. At the time of the court proceedings in April 1874, a photograph was taken of the inside of Mary Ellen's home. You can see it is rather unkempt. Apparently, Mary Ellen slept next to a window on a mattress and she was covered with a quilt. This is an artist's impression of Mary Ellen being brought into the court covered in a horse blanket. In court that day, there was a reporter from the New York Tribune, Jacob Rees. He later wrote, "I saw a child brought in, at the sight of which men wept aloud and heard the story that roused the conscience of the world." At this point, I want to tell you about the background of Mary Ellen Wilson. Her mother, Frances Connor, left England in 1858 at the age of 18. She traveled to New York with an uncle and a cousin. In New York, she got a job in the laundry of the St. Nicholas Hotel, where she met her future husband, Thomas Wilson, who worked in the kitchen. They were married in 1861. With the onset of the American Civil War, Thomas enlisted in the New York Irish Brigade to fight on the Unionist side. He later changed his regiment, but was killed soon afterwards in May 1864. We do not know precisely when Mary Ellen was born, but think it was early in 1864. Frances could not make ends meet on a widow's pension of $2 a week, and out of necessity continued working in the laundry of the hotel. At work, she had an acquaintance who agreed to introduce her to a lady called Mary Score, who lived at Mulberry Bend. Mary Score agreed to look after Mary Ellen. Initially, the arrangement seemed to be working, but with time, visits became irregular and Frances stopped making payments. Mary Score then decided to hand Mary Ellen over to the Department of Public Charities. From there, she was transferred to the almshouse on Blackwell's Island. It was there that she first encountered the married couple, Thomas and Mary McCormick. The McCormicks had had 3 children of their own, all of whom had died. Thomas McCormick told his wife that Mary Ellen was his illegitimate child. The McCormicks dealt with an official called George Kellogg. They did not tell him that Mary Ellen was McCormick's illegitimate child. Kellogg asked Mary if she wanted Mary Ellen, and she said she did. On production of a doctor's letter, Mary Ellen was given to the McCormicks. They returned 2 weeks later to sign an indenture agreement, which was to last until Mary Ellen was 18 years old. After Mary Ellen had been with the McCormicks 7 months, Thomas McCormick died of cholera. About a year later, Mary married a Francis Connolly. At the time of the Connolly marriage, Mary Ellen was 3 years old. She remained with the Connollys until the intervention of Etta Wheeler 6 years later. This is a photograph of Mulberry Bend taken in about 1880. Mary Score, who was married, lived there with her 3 children. At the time, Mulberry Bend was renowned for its poverty, unsanitary conditions, and criminality. Mary Ellen moved there when she was 5 or 6 months and stayed for a further year. The only evidence we have of the relationship between Frances Wilson and her daughter is from Mary Score. In her court statement, Mary Score said that Frances was affectionate towards Mary Ellen. The Mary Ellen case generated widespread publicity both nationally and internationally. There were numerous requests to adopt Mary Ellen, including from the family in England. While Judge Lawrence considered the matter, he placed Mary Ellen in 2 institutions which Etta Wheeler regarded as totally unsuitable. She wrote to Mr. Bergh, who in turn petitioned Judge Lawrence. After a period of about a year, Judge Lawrence awarded custody to Etta Wheeler. Initially, Etta Wheeler placed Mary Ellen with her mother, Sally Angel. A few months later, Sally Angel died of tuberculosis, and Mary Ellen moved in with Etta's sister Elizabeth and her husband Darius Spencer. Mary Ellen spent the rest of her childhood with the Spencers. Mary Ellen had a happy and productive life. She married when she was 24 years old and had 2 daughters. Her first daughter was named Etta after Etta Wheeler. This is a photograph of Mary Ellen in old age. She died in 1956 at the age of 92. This is a photograph of Florence and Etta at the graveside of their grandfather, Thomas Wilson. Etta is on the right. You may be wondering what happened to their grandmother, Frances Wilson. She married again to a soldier called Gibbons, but died of lung hemorrhage at the age of 34. This has been taken from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle of the 28th of April, 1874. Mary Connolly was found guilty of assault and battery. She was acquitted on the more serious charge of felonious assault. This picture shows the original handwritten transcripts of the Mary Ellen case. These transcripts are published in the book Case Number 1, The Mary Ellen Wilson Files. This book has much interesting material. In preparing this talk, I have used the book extensively and thank the authors and the publisher. The transcripts do not reveal anything of the 6-year period Mary Ellen spent in the Connolly home. One interesting fact is that John Connor, Frances's cousin, said that Frances had told him that she had been told that Mary Ellen had died. It is often said that Mary Ellen was the first child to be removed from her family. However, this is not technically correct. In 1871, Mr. Bergh became involved with an 8-year-old child, Emily Thompson. Emily was cruelly treated by her stepmother, a Mrs. Larkin. Neighbors who witnessed the cruel treatment of Emily made representations to Mr. Bergh. As a consequence, Emily was removed from the home of her stepmother. When Emily appeared before Judge Barnard, she was badly bruised, but denied that she had been beaten by Mrs. Larkin. On the basis of Emily's bruising and witness statements, Judge Barnard convicted Mrs. Larkin and gave her a suspended sentence. Crucially, Emily was allowed home with Mrs. Larkin. At the time of the court case, Mrs. Larkin stated that Emily's parents were dead. She claimed that she had been given Emily to look after by her grandmother, Mrs. Bickham. She told the judge that Mrs. Bickham had subsequently died. This, however, was a lie, as Mrs. Bickham was still alive. As a result of the widespread publicity surrounding this case, it came to the attention of Mrs. Bickham. She immediately contacted Mr. Bergh, who took her to see Judge Barnard. He, in turn, awarded custody to Mrs. Bickham, and Emily was removed from Mrs. Larkin. This is a picture of Henry Bergh. Henry Bergh was of German descent. His father was a very well-known shipbuilder. Henry was the youngest of the 3 Bergh children. When the Bergh parents died in the 1840s, The Bergh children were left with a considerable fortune. Henry enrolled at Columbia to do law, but dropped out. Instead, he decided to use his wealth to travel throughout Europe. He was married to Catherine Matilda Taylor in 1836, but did not have any children. Bergh liked writing and wrote a number of plays and poems, none of which came to anything. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln appointed him to the American legation in St. Petersburg. Both he and his wife did not like the Russian climate, and he resigned after he had only been there 1 year. While Bergh had been traveling in Europe, he had been appalled at the animal cruelty he had seen. Bergh knew of the RSPCA in England and determined to stop off in London on his way home. In London, he met with the President, Lord Harrowby. Bergh returned to New York in 1865 and immediately started lobbying for animal rights to be enshrined in law. 3 days after that was achieved, he founded the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in 1866. Another of Bergh's achievements was the founding of the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children in 1875. On the left is a photograph of Lord Harrowby. He was the president of the RSPCA when Bergh met with him. The RSPCA was a well-established organization, having been formed in 1824. Henry Bergh spent some months in London observing the workings of the society. In his attempt to enforce the laws against animal cruelty, Bergh made himself many enemies. He became the subject of much derision and ridicule. Nevertheless, he resolutely stuck to the task at hand. There were many Henry Bergh cartoons, some of which implied that he was more interested in animals than humans. This is one such cartoon. It is particularly pertinent as Bergh publicly stated that he found bullfighting despicable. This is a picture of Henry Bergh's grave. At the time of his death in 1888, he was very well known and hugely respected. An obituary at the time rather aptly stated, Bergh aroused and quickened the dormant sentiments of pity and kindness for animals. On the left-hand side of this slide is a photograph of Elbridge Gerry. He is the lawyer who secured the removal of Mary Ellen from the Connolly home. Gerry was both very influential and wealthy. On the right of the slide is a picture of his home. He had his own private art gallery. Gerry's grandfather was the 5th Vice President of America. He was the politician who gave us the English term gerrymandering. At that time, parents could be charged with assault or cruelty to their children. However, children were never removed from their homes. As far back as colonial times, magistrates had the power to remove children, but that never happened. It is claimed that Gerry was the first person to use Section 65 of the Habeas Corpus Act to secure the removal of a child from the family home. Habeas corpus is the Latin for you should have the body. Gerry was the second president of the NYSPCC, and he remained counsel to the society until his death in 1927. In New York, the society was referred to as the Gerry Society. Officers of the society were known as Gerry men. This shows a newspaper headline when the society's first children's court opened. It was not long after Henry Bergh formed the ASPCC that there were calls for a similar society to protect children. Clamour for this to happen increased after the widespread publicity of the Emily Thompson and Mary Ellen cases. At the end of the Mary Ellen case, Henry Bergh assured Etta Wheeler that he would do the same for children. Bergh and Gerry lobbied philanthropists, including the Vanderbilts, and in 1875, the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children was formed. The first president was a Quaker called John Wright. This document, entitled Children's Protective Society, was handwritten by Bergh at the time of the inception of the society. At the bottom can be seen the signatures of Bergh, Gerry, and Wright. On the right of the slide is a typed copy. This is a photograph of John Wright. Bergh did not want to be president, and the task of finding the most appropriate person was left to Gerry. Wright was a highly respected philanthropist with both drive and energy. His father had been in shipbuilding, and Wright was a leather merchant. Initially, Bergh accommodated the NYSPCC. Then they moved into their own building, which is shown here. In the first 8 months, hundreds of complaints were investigated. There were 68 criminal prosecutions, and 72 children were taken into care. The work of the society mushroomed, and it soon became clear that bigger premises were required. In 1893, this building became the society headquarters. This slide shows a carriage which was used to transport children and their families. On the left side of this slide is a picture of Thomas Agnew, a Liverpool banker who made a trip to New York in 1881, where he learned about the New York Society. On his return to Liverpool, he and others formed the Liverpool Society in 1883. On the right of the slide is shown Liverpool Society's first building. A year later, in 1884, the London Society was formed. Other branches were also established. Despite campaigning by the London Society, politicians were very reluctant to interfere within families. It took a further 5 years for the 1889 Act to be passed. When that happened, all the societies merged to form the National Society. The National Society was given a royal charter in 1895, and Queen Victoria became its first patron. Over the next century and more, child protection has evolved. There have been a series of children acts. Some of these have followed inquiries where children have come to serious harm. We now have child protection registers, with each child having a child protection plan. In recent years, legislation has focused on agencies such as the local authority, health, and the police working together to safeguard children. In 2003, the first Minister for Children was appointed, and in 2005, a Children's Commissioner was established. No pediatrician could give a talk on the history of child protection without mentioning this man. Karl-Heinz Kempe was born in Breslau in Germany, which is now Wrocław in Poland. He was 15 when a Quaker agency in England facilitated his arrival in London via the Kinder transport. He was initially housed near Oxford and later sailed for America. In America, Kempe learned a new language, changed his name, and eventually qualified in medicine. He became a very distinguished virologist and pediatrician. In 1956, he was appointed as the chairman of the Department of Pediatrics at Denver in Colorado. Kempe's main achievement was the writing of a classic paper in 1962 entitled The Battered Child Syndrome. Following this landmark publication, Kempe brought the problem of child physical abuse to the attention of the medical and nursing professions through his many lectures and publications. Kempe campaigned vigorously for the mandatory reporting of child abuse. This was eventually achieved in all states of America. As a consequence of Kempe's effort, vast sums of state money was poured into child protection. Towards the end of Kempe's life, he and others, such as David Finkelhor, brought to the attention of society the hidden problem of child sexual abuse. Before 1962, child abuse was not recognized as a major societal problem. About 100 years earlier, in 1860, a French forensic physician, Ambroise Tardieu, had written about child abuse. This did not receive much publicity, probably because it was published in French. In the 1940s and 50s, there were reports suggesting that caregivers were deliberately inflicting injuries on their children. Medical professionals found it very hard to accept that caregivers would deliberately inflict harm on children. On the other hand, Kempe, realizing that this was a major societal problem with serious consequences, decided to give the problem of child abuse maximum publicity. He published his paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is a very widely read journal. He also chose an eye-catching title, The Battered Child Syndrome. The co-authors included a psychiatrist and a radiologist. William Druckenmuller was a medical student, and as part of his student project, he collected the information for Kempe. After he qualified in 1960, he left Denver and handed all the data to Kempe in 2 shoeboxes. I am including this slide to show that professionals can go about their duty of protecting children without any fear. Some years ago, a 2-month-old baby presented to me with a fractured femur. There was no explanation for the fracture, and the child was removed from the family. While in care, about 9 months later, further fractures were sustained. A diagnosis of brittle bone disease, osteogenesis imperfecta, was made, and the child was returned to the family. Needless to say, the parents were very aggrieved and decided to sue me. Hence this newspaper's headline. This case, together with 2 other cases of wrongful diagnosis, eventually went to the House of Lords, which at that time was the highest court in England. In a majority verdict, it was pronounced that it was not possible to sue a doctor, provided that doctor had acted in the best interests of the child. This case, which did not get much media attention, is an important case as it is a legal precedent. I have now concluded my talk. I hope you found it interesting. Thank you for listening.